it's actually perfectly clear when the war will end. This is when Russian troops withdraw from Ukraine.
Settlements are a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits one country from transferring their civilian population in territory occupied or acquired by war.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to the Struggle Video News. You've seen the pictures of the rescue workers going through the rubble heroically to save victims of the earthquake in Turkey and northwest Syria. The ones in Syria all wear the same dark blue and bright yellow jackets and white helmets. They're the Syrian Civil Defense, popularly known as the White Helmets. They've been demonized by the Gray Zone and the others in the authoritarian bootlicker clan. In truth, they are amazing. We urge you to see the photo essay on the New Lines website. We link to it on our website, thestruggle.org. Ukraine. A German member of parliament appeared on the Democracy Now! Program and expressed defeatism about Ukrainian efforts to defeat the Russian invasion. This member of the left party, Sevim Dagdilin, criticized what she called illusionists. And she said, they are underestimating Russia like Napoleon and Hitler did in the past. And she continued, and there is no way to win a war, a conventional war, against such a nuclear power. On his blog, Linux Speech, Clay Claiborne blasted her and wrote this in answer to her claim. Really? Tell that to the Vietnamese and the Iraqis and the Afghans twice against two nuclear powers. No way to win a war of independence against a nuclear power. Read Clay's whole article at claysbeach.blogspot.com. Now I want to move to two very positive interviews on Democracy Now! For a long time, the program has neglected Syria, but in the wake of the horrible earthquake, there was an interview on February 9th of the outstanding writer and former longtime political prisoner named Yassin al-Haj. He said that, in a sense, Syria is becoming a path the whole world is taking.
The worst about it is that it leads to securitization of politics and to more influence of those who are involved in security, which is in my country and in the world. Those who are busying themselves in killing people and torturing them and raping them and making their life hell. So this priority built sort of a common ground between the U.S. administrations and the regime, the Syrian regime, and actually it has empowered all those who were already powerful and weakened those popular movements and individuals and activists and those who struggle for human rights and for democracy.
And after talking about the effect early sanctions on Syria had against him when he was in prison, he had this to say about the current American sanctions.
Look, when I was in jail in all 1980s and more than half of 1990s, there was sanctions against the Assad regime, the pair at the time, the Hafez, after an assault or a bomb, I guess it was put in an Israeli plane in 1986 or 1987. And we were in jail at the time, and we were impacted by it, actually. I mean, even our families were impacted, and we were impacted. I was a smoker at that time, just to give one example, and we didn't have cigarettes, we didn't have even to choose, sanity. I don't remember the word in English. So we lacked so many things in jail. Now my position about sanctions is the same. I want my people to live in a better condition. I don't approve of the sanctions. I know that the Assad regime will benefit very much by lifting the sanctions, and of course I am ambivalent about this. I don't want. They are extremely corrupt, and they will steal most of the aid. There are already reports about this, by the way. But at the same time, I don't want my people to starve and to be humiliated by hunger and by dire needs, as it has been happening all the time. So I find myself in not very good position, actually. As I've just said, I am ambivalent. I want the country, the people of the country to not to suffer from oppression and from starvation.
On the same program, Amy Goodman interviewed an exiled Russian journalist, Alexy Kovalev. He's an investigative editor of Meduza, a news outlet that had just been criminalized by Putin. After talking about the dismal state of Russian journalism, Goodman asked him about the claim by former Prime Minister of Israel, Bennett, who said that he had mediated a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine last spring, but that the West had sabotaged it. Here is Kovalev's answer.
It's actually perfectly clear when the war will end. This is when Russian troops withdraw from Ukraine. Not sooner, not later. I mean, this is pretty straightforward. So any proposed peace deal must involve that. And it doesn't sound to me very likely that a peace solution could have been reached at any point in the first months of the war, while the Russian army was occupying large chunks of Ukraine, which then if Ukrainians were pushed into a peace deal, for example, in summer last year, they would have had to concede large chunks of their territory, which they later liberated. So it doesn't seem very likely to me that a peace deal could be reached could be negotiated by some third party last year. And I don't think it's ethical for anyone to claim credit for the effort.
So this Russian journalist is quite clear. The way towards peace is for Russia to pull its troops out of Ukraine. On the subject of Ukraine, look at a tweet by Scott Ritter, who will be one of the speakers at a rally in D.C. demanding no more weapons to Ukraine. He tweets, "There are some rabid dogs out there, and we need Atticus Finch to shoot them. Ukraine is a rabid dog. Russia is Atticus Finch. Thus ends my lesson." To me, this is an open call for genocide of Ukrainians. I wonder how folks like Chris Hedges and David Swanson can justify appearing on a platform with Scott Ritter. I wrote an article condemning this rally in D.C., and I talk about the backstory of some of the speakers. It's at Ukraine Posts. Here's a short link to it, tiny URL /Red Brown Rally. In Middletown, Connecticut on February 5th, there was a memorial rally for workers who died in 2010 in an explosion during the building of the clean natural gas power plant. The construction company recklessly used methane gas to clean things away. There was a spark and 6 men were killed. The company suffered a fine, but no one went to jail for the criminal negligence. About Palestine, some good news. The mayor of Barcelona, Spain, has cut off all institutional relations with apartheid Israel. You may know about the huge rallies in Israel calling for preservation of democracy for Jews. Look at this headline, startling, about a profound split in the Jewish community in Israel. Is civil war possible? I don't know. But I do know if it starts, the democratic forces won't have a chance unless they abandon Zionism and join in a mutual struggle for democracy with Palestinians. Now more of the address by Omar Shakir of Human Rights Watch at Yale University.
That there is a related crime against humanity known as persecution. I won't focus on it significantly today, but just so you know, persecution is defined also, it's customary international law, it's prohibited, as severe abuses of fundamental rights when combined with a discriminatory intent. So there's a large amount of overlap between the two definitions. So I just mentioned the process of how we did the research, and I mentioned the law. When Human Rights Watch applied those facts to the law that I documented, we reached the conclusion that Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution against Palestinians. So I want to devote the bulk of my time to describing how we reached that conclusion. And again, it's a 200-page report, so I'm just going to give you the highlights. I'm very happy in the discussion to go into greater depth. So let's take those 3 elements I mentioned and apply them to what we found in our research. Starting with the intent to dominate, right? So you need an intent to dominate. Human Rights Watch concluded that Israeli authorities do maintain an intent to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians. This largely manifests itself through the desire to control land and demographics for the benefit of Jewish Israelis and to the detriment of Palestinians. Let me give you an example first of the demographics. Israel, since 2003, has had a law that prohibits the granting of long-term legal status to Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza married to Israeli citizens or nationals. Let me simplify that for you. Israelis can marry people of virtually every nationality in the world and grant them the legal status to live with them in Israel, but not Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza. Now, Israel justifies this policy in the name of security, but our report includes loads of evidence of why this policy was justified by the desire to maintain a demographic supermajority of Jewish Israelis vis-a-vis Palestinians. It's a discriminatory policy. There are many, many other examples the report highlights. Now, the second part of the intent to dominate that we document is maximizing the land for Jewish Israelis and confining Palestinians into smaller and smaller enclaves. Now, this is an explicit policy. Within Israel proper, for example, it takes different forms, but it's explicit. Within Israel proper, and again, for those that are really new to Israel and Palestine, when I say Israel proper, we're talking about 78% of the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. The other 22% is the occupied Palestinian territory, which is the West Bank and Gaza. So within Israel, the government has a formal policy to Judaize the Negev and the Galilee. The Negev and Galilee account for about 2/3 of the land in Israel. It's where most Palestinians in Israel live. So there's a formal government policy to Judaize these areas. Jerusalem, the municipality of Jerusalem, which includes occupied East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem, the we reviewed in the report the government policy planning documents, which lay out in explicit terms that the objective of the municipality is to, quote, maintain a solid Jewish majority in the city. Now imagine a written policy to maintain the superiority of one group over the other. And by the way, it's not just that. The policy lists the target demographic ratios they hope to maintain and identifies prescriptive policies to further that goal. Densification of Palestinian neighborhoods, for example. Take the West Bank. In the West Bank, we reviewed decades of Israeli government policy documents, which lay out in plain terms the government's objective to basically maximize settlements, build them between Palestinian communities. And it's written out. For example, the 1983 Drobel's plans, one of the government policy documents, calls for, quote, settle the land between the Arab minority population centers and their surroundings, end quote. Noting that doing so would make it, quote, hard for Palestinians to create territorial continuity and political unity and remove any trace of doubt about our intent to control Judea and Samaria, which is now, end quote, their term for the West Bank, forever. And it's not just words on paper. These are policies that are backed up by massive land grabs, investment and integration to connect settlements and roads and water, electricity networks between the illegal settlements. And let me note again, because I'm not speaking to a legal audience here, settlements are a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits one country from transferring their civilian population and territory occupied or acquired by war. Right? We'll get to more in the West Bank in a second, but these are war crimes. And they're basically saying we're going to prioritize the land for these illegal settlements over indigenous Palestinian communities. And then even in Gaza, right? So Gaza, Israel withdrew its civilian settler population in 2005, but continues to pursue a strategy to basically turn the Gaza Strip into a demographic receptacle to hold, it's 25 by 7 miles, okay? 2.1 million Palestinians live there. It's an open-air prison, one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. And basically Israel had removed about 8,000 settlers in order, and we studied the policy. And we'll get more into the Gaza policy, but basically they use Gaza as a way of sort of taking Palestinians off the demographic books, trying to concentrate them there and outside of the West Bank, which they hope to retain. Now let me make one point clear. Israel justifies many of its policies in the name of security. However, many of the abuses at the core of apartheid, for example, the marriage ban that I talked about, the 2003 prohibition, or even the granting of building permits to Jewish Israelis systematically but not to Palestinians, or the land expropriation for settlers from Palestinians, have no security. Security is not offered as a justification. Israel doesn't even try to offer it because there is no security justification. And even where security is a consideration for Israel, for example, in the policy towards Gaza, Israel has pursued a policy that goes so far beyond what international law authorizes that security no more can justify their oppression than security could justify torture or other very serious crimes. So let me conclude this part of my presentation by saying this evidence, and I just gave you like the, examples, led us to conclude that the Israeli government has pursued an intent to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians. So that's 1/3 of our puzzle, right? So let's move to part 2 of the puzzle. So that intent exists. Now, does systematic oppression of Palestinians exist? Second part. We concluded, yes, that the Israeli government has methodically established a 2-tiered system that privileges Jewish Israelis to the detriment of Palestinians. That looks different in different areas. So let me go through each area in brief. So let's go to the West Bank. We talked about the West Bank a second ago. The West Bank, you have about 2.5 million Palestinians living amid 700,000 Jewish Israelis living in the illegal settlements I mentioned earlier. Now in this area, you have people who live across the street, literally across the street. I've been there, I've seen it. But there are 2 different legal systems. One for Jewish Israelis, one for Palestinians. So if a Jewish Israeli and a Palestinian commit the exact same crime in the exact same place, they are tried in different courts, where different laws apply to them, where they receive different due process rights, Or if I'm being more specific, one has due process, one doesn't. And where they receive different sentences for the very same act. Not only that, but in the West Bank, Israel enforces segregation. So Palestinians cannot enter settlements which, footnote, were built on land expropriated from Palestinians. Even land that Palestinians own, they cannot enter those settlements except if they are entering as a laborer bearing a special permit. In addition, Israel not only has expropriated the land and resources, but it provides it on a discriminatory basis for the settlers and to the detriment of Palestinians. So, separate and unequal allocation, segregation, dual bodies of law. Let's move to East Jerusalem. Now, East Jerusalem is a part of the West Bank. Israel occupied it in 1967, continues to occupy, but Israel annexed it. So East Jerusalem, Israel considers part of its territory. But many of these same dynamics persist in East Jerusalem. Let me give you one example. If two students come to Yale from Jerusalem, one is Jewish Israeli, one is Palestinian, they live in the same city, they might even live across the street. The Jewish Israeli is a citizen of Israel. They could spend 4 years, they could do a PhD here, they could spend a decade, they could go back, they have the same legal status, they're a citizen. But a Palestinian Jerusalemite, right, almost assuredly is not a citizen. They're actually a stateless person that has residency, even though they are from Jerusalem, they're given the status of resident, like a foreigner in Jerusalem, and they could lose that status, their ability to live in their home city, simply by being abroad for too long. And this is not some abstract idea. About 15,000 Palestinians have lost their right to live in Jerusalem because they were abroad too long, or they moved to the wrong part of the West Bank. Okay, so that's West Bank, East Jerusalem. Let's move to Gaza, the other part of the occupied Palestinian territory. Now, I mentioned the size of Gaza and the population. Since 2007, the Israeli government has maintained a closure policy of Gaza. What that means is there's a generalized ban on movement. Nobody can exit, nobody can enter, except if you fit within a narrow band of humanitarian exemptions. So that means the vast majority of Gaza residents have never left the 25 by 7 mile open air prison. This is not some abstract thing. My colleague, who I supervise and manage, our Gaza senior research assistant, when I started this job in late 2016, she had never left Gaza in her life. She was 31 years old, well-educated, and she left for the first time by some stroke of luck, another long process with the intervention of a foreign embassy. The only way she could leave in 2018. I met her for the first time. I'd worked with her for a year and a half. But even despite that, if she applied a week, like right now she's back in Gaza, if she wants to apply to leave, she will be rejected. Not because she poses a security risk. It's not a security policy. It's not about whether or not you're on a list. It's a ban on everybody unless you show a very urgent humanitarian need, like you need a life-saving surgery. Right? So 15 years that people, it's not just that they can't go to America. They can't go to Ramallah, which is part of the occupied Palestinian territory. You should be able to move between Gaza and Ramallah, which even Israel considers one territorial entity, the way you might move between New York City, and New Haven, right? If the Wi-Fi was maybe better on the Amtrak. My point is, it should be something you do, presumptively pretty easy, right? But in Gaza, you can't even go to the other part of your own territory. And it's not just a ban on the movement of people, it's also a ban on the movement of goods. So during the first 3 years of the closure, between 2007 and 2010, Israel kept a calorie count, an average caloric count of how many calories they wanted someone in Gaza to eat, and they would limit what was allowed in based on that caloric count. When that went public, the Israeli government changed that policy, but they still maintained strict restrictions. In addition, they limit exports out of Gaza, not for security reasons. I mean, what's the security threat of strawberries going to Ramallah or eggplant going into Israel? They do it to starve the economy. Today in Gaza, 80% of the population relies on humanitarian aid. The majority of people spend the majority of their day without electricity, right? Well, electricity is provided 24/7 to Jewish Israelis that live in the occupied territory, that live just across the Gaza fences. In addition to all that, right, the majority of the population has not left all of the Gaza Strip. The GDP per capita for the people studying economics in the room has gone down since the early 1990s by about 23%. This is circa a few years ago. So that's Gaza. And the third part is within Israel proper, where Palestinians, and let's be clear, they're about 20% of the population, inside Israel they're citizens. So unlike the first three, they are citizens of Israel. But at the same time, they still face systemic discrimination, including on their access to land, even their legal status, right? They are citizens, yes, of Israel, but they're not nationals. In fact, Israel in 2018 passed a law with constitutional status known as the Jewish nation-state law that basically said Israel is not only a state for the Jewish people, but that certain rights, including the right to self-determination, the access to settlement, land basically, is for the Jewish people alone, and not for the 20% of the population that's not Jewish. To give you one example, Israeli law permits small towns and communities to basically exclude people from living there. And research shows that there are hundreds of small Jewish towns and villages that have no Palestinians living there, that have admissions committees that block Palestinians from living there. Palestinians, about 20% of the population, live on about 3% of the land. I can give many other data points. Put it all together, Human Rights Watch concluded that systematic oppression of Palestinians for the benefit of Jewish Israelis exists. So we now have two of the three parts of the puzzle: intent to dominate and systematic oppression. The third part of the puzzle was inhumane acts. And Human Rights Watch again concluded that the Israeli authorities have committed inhumane acts against Palestinians. Our report focused on 5 clusters of inhumane acts. Now, this is not an exclusive list. There are other lists by Amnesty International, by Palestinian Israeli groups that are different. But let me just briefly mention the inhumane acts that we've documented at Human Rights Watch. One, and I've already talked about the movement restrictions, right, from Gaza. But let me talk about the movement restrictions in the West Bank. In the West Bank, Palestinians require permits to enter large sections of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for the Struggle Video News.